They say the Ozarks never forget. The valleys may fill with mist, and the trees may fall and rot, but the soil remembers every sin buried beneath it. In the summer of 1877, the valley south of Salem, Missouri, was quiet, too quiet for a place once drenched in blood. Folks still whispered the name, though never above a murmur, the Alden family, a name that should have been wiped from memory, but somehow clung to the land like a stain that no sermon could wash away. What began as a story of faith and fortune ended in silence, sealed behind shuttered windows and an empty church that no one dared to reclaim. The last record of their existence was a marriage certificate. Elias Alden and Clara Mee Winslow, June 3, 1877. After that, no one in town wrote another word about them. It was as if the ink itself refused to remember. The Aldens came from Tennessee, prosperous traders, pious folk on the surface. But those who met Elias said there was something hollow behind his eyes, as if he carried a hunger not meant for this world. When he arrived in Ozark Valley, he purchased a stretch of land near the river bend and built a farmhouse in a week's time, employing no workers, no carpenters, no witnesses. Only the sound of hammering at night and the smell of burning pine in the mornings. By fall, Clara was pregnant. The midwife who visited once never returned, leaving her tools behind. When questioned, she simply said, "There's something wrong with the light in that house." Neighbors began finding strange carvings on their fence post, triangles inside circles, marked in ash, and at dusk they claimed to see Elias kneeling in the fields, his hands buried deep in the soil, whispering to something beneath the ground. One farmer swore he heard another voice whisper back. It wasn't until the first frost that the valley realized the truth. There were no animals left within miles of the Alden land. Not a crow, not a dog, not even the night insects. The silence was total, and the silence had a name. Ozark Valley remembers what the people tried to forget, and if you listen long enough, it will tell you what it saw that winter. By February of 1878, the snow had sealed the valley in white. Travelers heading south spoke of a strange stillness in the hills, a quiet so deep it made men forget their own names. Somewhere in that silence, the Alden house stood like a wound that refused to close. The chimney no longer smoked, and yet from the road a faint light flickered behind the curtains each night. When a local man, Samuel Brigg, volunteered to check on them, the townsfolk begged him not to. But duty outweighed superstition. He reached the farmhouse at dusk, his boots breaking through the snow crust like bones snapping underfoot. The front door was open. Inside, the air smelled of iron and pine tar. The table was set for 3, but only 2 chairs were pulled out. Samuel said later that there were handprints on the walls, small ones, as if made by a child, but burned into the plaster like someone had pressed them there with fire. Upstairs he found the cradle, empty, just a torn scrap of cloth, the initials C.M.A. stitched in blue. He turned to leave, and that's when he saw Elias standing in the doorway, his face gray as candle wax. He said Elias smiled, but his lips never moved. The sheriff's report from that night was only 2 sentences long. Brigg found no living souls at the Alden place. The property is condemned. But that wasn't the end of it. Weeks later, Samuel began digging trenches on his own land, saying he needed to keep the ground breathing. He stopped eating, stopped speaking. His wife said he'd sit by the window at night, muttering to the earth. By spring, 6 families had moved away from the valley. The rest stayed out of necessity, though they spoke little of what had happened. Some said Clara had been seen near the river, her white dress dragging through the mud, singing lullabies to something that wasn't there. Others claimed the child had survived, that it lived beneath the house waiting for the thaw. When the thaw finally came, the river flooded, sweeping through the lower fields and uncovering what the frost had hidden. Wooden beams, a length of chain, and a door that led nowhere. And still, the night birds never came back. By the turn of summer, Ozark Valley had learned to live with its silence. The townspeople plowed their fields, raised their barns, and spoke only in whispers when the name Alden drifted into conversation. But every story, no matter how buried, finds a way to rise again, and this one clawed its way up from the mud in the form of a letter. In 1883, 6 years after the Aldens vanished, a packet arrived at the postmaster's desk in Salem. It bore no return address, only the words "deliver to the oldest living Alden kin." Inside were 4 pages written in a trembling hand, the ink brown with age, the script half, washed away by water or tears. It was signed Clara Me Alden. The letter spoke of confinement, of a sickness in the land that grew inside her husband and spread through their home like a fever that could think. She wrote that Elias believed the valley itself was a living thing, something ancient and hungry. He had come to Ozark Valley not for peace, but to make a covenant. She wrote, he said the soil speaks to him in the language of our ancestors, that the earth remembers before man was born. She described nights when the walls would breathe and the lamps would go out all at once. How Elias would wake and kneel by the cellar door, whispering her name, though his voice sounded like a dozen mouths trying to speak through him. And the child, the one she carried, she said it moved too soon. It kicked before it had form. She said it dreamed before it was born. The last line of the letter was scrawled across the page, as if written in panic. If anyone finds this, do not look for the child. The land will claim what is its own. The postmaster never spoke of who received the letter, but for years afterward there were rumors of strangers traveling through the valley. Men with government badges, historians, even priests. None stayed long. All of them asked the same question: where was the Alden land? But the strange thing was, no one could find it any more. The bend in the river where the house once stood had shifted. The valley had changed its shape, like the land itself was hiding what it had done. And maybe it was. By the early 1900s, what was left of Ozark Valley had been consumed by forest. A few fence posts remained, gray in halves, wallowed by moss, but the road that once led to the Alden farm was gone, folded into the landscape as if it had never existed. Old timers who'd been children in 1008, 177, claimed they could still hear the faint sound of a baby crying on quiet nights, carried through the pines like a wind that had lost its way home. Most dismissed it as folklore, but one man refused to. His name was Reverend Thaddeus Morrow. He arrived in 1904, saying God had sent him to cleanse the land of its curse. He built a small mission near the old river crossing, using wood from the surrounding forest. Locals warned him not to dig too deep into the soil, but he ignored them. The ground, he said, was soft with memory, and that was where redemption could begin. Within weeks, his congregation began to dwindle. Those who helped raise the mission fell ill, their fingernails blackened, their eyes turned red with broken veins. One survivor described hearing a low hum at night coming from beneath the chapel floorboards. It wasn't music, she said. It was like something under there was breathing through the dirt. When the sheriff rode out to investigate, he found the chapel empty, no reverend, no congregation, just rows of pews facing a wall where the cross had been carved upside down. And behind the pulpit, a hole in the ground, deep, narrow, and lined with wood like the shaft of a well. The report said he dropped a stone inside. It never hit bottom. Locals say that years later, during a drought, the earth split open along that same ridge, revealing old timbers and the rotted outline of a cellar door. The ground around it was burned black, though no fire had passed through that part of the valley in decades. It was then that people began to remember the words from Clara's letter, how the land would claim what is its own. And still, no one dared to rebuild there. Hunters would pass through and speak of the air turning suddenly cold, of hearing whispers in the soil when the wind died. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Would you leave the land behind, or would you go back to see what called your name from beneath the dirt? By the time the Great Depression rolled across Missouri, the valley had become a ghost story used to frighten children. Maps no longer marked its boundaries, and the name Alden had faded into rumor. But stories have a way of circling back when the world grows desperate, and in 1932 a government survey team arrived to chart the forgotten lands of the Ozarks. They found the valley after days of searching. It wasn't on any record, but the guides knew when they'd entered it. The birds fell silent, the air felt heavy, wet with something older than weather. Their compass needles spun, refusing to settle. The men pitched camp on the ridge above what looked like an old foundation. Nothing more than stone and roots, but one of them, a man named Caro, said he'd seen something move beneath the rubble. The team recorded strange readings, pockets of heat under frozen ground, and a faint pulse of sound detected through their instrument, rhythmic, like a heartbeat echoing through rock. They were ordered to continue, but by the third night, Caro vanished. His tent was untouched. His footprints led halfway down the slope, then stopped mid-stride, as if the man had simply been erased. When the team reported the disappearance, the Bureau ordered them out immediately. Their journals were confiscated, only one page survived, a torn entry found decades later in a private collection. It read, "We found the door, it's still breathing." After that, the valley disappeared again officially this time. Maps were redrawn, survey routes changed, but older residents of Salem remember the weeks that followed. They say the river turned red with clay, and fish floated belly up for miles downstream. Some even claim to see a woman in white walking along the riverbank, her hair matted with mud, carrying a bundle against her chest. No one approached her. Those who did never returned. By winter, a fence was erected along the entire ridge. Government property, the signs read. Trespassing prohibited, but locals knew better. They said it wasn't the government keeping people out. It was the land keeping something in. And still, on certain nights when the fog rolls down the hills, the earth hums again. Not loud enough to frighten, just enough to remind the living that something beneath it still remembers being disturbed. In 1957, 80 years after Elias Alden's name vanished from record, the valley drew breath once more. A family from Arkansas, the Harts, bought the land cheap, unaware of its history. They said the soil was rich, untouched, perfect for farming. Within a month, their plow struck something buried deep beneath the field. An iron ring, rusted but solid, fixed into the earth like the handle of a hatch. They pulled, but it wouldn't move. That night, their youngest daughter woke screaming, claiming she'd heard someone knocking beneath her window from the ground below. She said a man's voice told her his name was Elias, and that he was her kin. The next morning, the family found animal bones laid in a perfect circle around their doorstep. Not scatter, deranged. The local sheriff told them to burn the remains and say no more about it. They did. But the knocking didn't stop. 2 weeks later, the Hart's eldest son walked into town barefoot, covered in mud up to his chest. He said he'd seen a door in the dirt open by itself, and that something climbed out, something shaped like a man, but with skin the color of ash. Before anyone could question him further, he began seizing and never spoke again. The Hart family left within the month. Their farmhouse was abandoned, swallowed by ivy and rot. But hunters who passed through later said they saw lights in the fields at night, soft, golden, pulsing like lanterns beneath the soil. One swore he heard the sound of a lullaby, sung in a voice that didn't belong to this century. By the 1970s, the government returned, sealing the property again and renaming it Ozark Preserve No. 9, but no records exist of what was preserved. The fences grew taller, the guards fewer, until finally there were none. Locals say the ground still moves there when the moon is thin. That sometimes, if you stand still long enough, you'll feel a slow heartbeat through the soles of your shoes. They say that's the bloodline, the one born from sin and silence, still pulsing beneath Ozark Valley, waiting for someone to open the earth again, And if you ever go there, if you ever find that hatch, remember the last words Clara Me Alden wrote before the valley took her. The land does not forgive, it only remembers. Some say the story ends there buried under government secrecy, sealed by time and fear. But history, real history, doesn't end. It decays, it seeps, it changes shape. In 1991, a hiker named Aaron Lowell went missing near the old Ozark Preserve line. His camera was found a week later, wedged between two roots by the river. The photographs were mostly ordinary, trees, riverbanks, empty sky, but the last image, that one stayed classified until a local reporter leaked it years later. It showed a clearing lit by moonlight. In the center stood what looked like an old wooden door, half buried in the dirt, with something dark and wet creeping out from underneath. The caption burned into the film edge read only 3 words, "It's still breathing." After that, the valley was closed again, not by fences this time, but by erasure. Satellite maps blurred the area. County records renamed it as conservation land. Even the locals stopped using its name, but the silence didn't stop spreading. In nearby towns, wells began to dry overnight, the water turning black with sediment no one could identify. Animals were found dead with their faces pressed into the mud, as though listening. In 2003, a small archaeological team tried to locate the Alden homestead using ground-penetrating radar. The machine failed almost instantly. They said the readings came back inverted, as if the ground beneath them wasn't solid, but hollow, and one of them, Dr. Keene, wrote something in her journal before she left the project. She wrote, "We didn't find the cellar, we stood inside it. Today, there's nothing left on paper, but you can still find the place if you know where to look. A forgotten turn-off Route 32, a rusted sign swallowed by vines, a quiet path that sinks lower and lower until the world around you feels older, heavier, wrong. The air turns thick, the forest forgets to breathe, and if you stand there long enough, if you dare, you might hear it too. The whisper in the soil, the faint heartbeat beneath your feet, the valley remembering the ones who came before, the bloodline that never died. So if you ever feel the ground move under you while you stand alone in the woods, don't listen, don't answer, because the land already knows your name.